Cock Lane runs north from Newgate Street, and it is short. A person walking it at a steady pace in the winter of 1762 would have covered its full length in perhaps a minute and a half, perhaps 2 minutes at most, if the ground were wet and required attention. It is approximately 100 yards from end to end, and it is narrow enough that two carts passing in opposite directions would have created a difficulty, a slowing, a negotiation of inches. On a winter evening, the brick of the facing houses closes the sky to a corridor overhead, and what light there was, the oil lamp mounted at the corner where Cock Lane met Newgate Street, its small reservoir of fish oil burning through its wick at the rate the city could afford, would have fallen on the wet stone of the road and on the lower courses of the brick walls, and not much further. Beyond the reach of that lamp, perhaps 15 or 20 feet north into the lane itself, the light gave out. This is where the story begins, not with anything strange, not yet, only with a street. The lamp at the corner of Cock Lane and Newgate Street was one of London's parish oil lamps, maintained under an arrangement between the local vestry and a contractor who was paid a modest fee to keep the wicks trimmed and the oil supplied across the winter months. In 1762, there were several thousand of these lamps distributed across the city of London and its adjoining parishes, hung at intervals along the principal streets on iron brackets fixed into the stonework or brickwork at a height of roughly 8 feet, their glass panels casting a yellowish pool of light onto the cobbles below. The principal streets, Newgate Street itself, Holborn to the north, Fleet Street to the south, had enough of these lamps that a person walking them after dark could maintain a reasonable orientation, could read a street sign if they held it close to a lamp, could make out the face of a person approaching from a few yards away. The lanes and courts running off these main arteries had fewer lamps, and some of the narrower alleys that threaded between properties in this part of Smithfield had none at all. Cock Lane was not entirely unlit. It had its corner lamp. It had on some accounts a second lamp partway along its length, mounted on the wall of one of the houses on the eastern side. Between these two sources of light, and in the stretch of lane north of the second lamp, where the street curved slightly toward West Smithfield, the darkness on a winter evening without moonlight would have been nearly complete. A person standing in that northern portion of Cock Lane at 10 o'clock on a January night in 1762, looking south toward Newgate Street, would have seen the small amber glow of the corner lamp at the far end of the lane, as a point of light at considerable remove, the brick walls on either side of it barely visible, the lane between themselves, and that distant glow, a dark passage in which the shapes of doorways and window frames and the occasional projection of a sign or bracket would have been distinguishable only on the closest approach. This particular quality of darkness, partial, patchy, interrupted by small pools of warm light that made the surrounding dark seem deeper by contrast, was characteristic of London's built environment in the mid-18th century. It shaped how the city was experienced after sundown in ways that a person accustomed to modern street lighting would find difficult to reconstruct in imagination. The difficulty is not in imagining darkness itself, which is available to anyone in any sufficiently remote place. The difficulty is in imagining this specific kind of darkness, urban darkness, the darkness of a place where other people are present and active, and where the sounds of the city continue, voices, wheels on stone, the distant bellowing from the Smithfield livestock pens, the watch calling the hour somewhere to the east, but where the visual field contracts sharply to a few lit feet of road, and the remainder of the street, the houses, the courts, the other pedestrians moving through it, exists only as sound and shape and proximity without clear outline. London in 1762 was a city of perhaps 700,000 people, and Smithfield, the district that held Cock Lane within its geography, was among its most densely inhabited commercial quarters. The great livestock market at Smithfield had operated on more or less the same ground for several centuries, and in the mid-18th century it received cattle, sheep, pigs, and horses from farms across the home counties and beyond, with drovers arriving through the night and early morning hours so that trading could begin at first light. The scale of the market, by contemporary account, was considerable. On busy days, several thousand head of cattle moved through the market ground, with proportional numbers of sheep and pigs, and the noise and smell of the market extended outward through the surrounding streets in a radius that encompassed Cock Lane thoroughly. The sound of the overnight drovers bringing their animals along the roads from the north, the lowing of cattle, the hooves on roadstone, the voices of men walking alongside in the dark, carried through the winter air to the houses of the lane, audible through closed shutters, part of the ambient life of the neighborhood. The annual Bartholomew Fair, held each August on the Smithfield ground, was one of London's great popular entertainments, a charter fair that had been granted its trading rights in the medieval period, and had grown across the centuries into a sprawling event of several days, during which the open ground of Smithfield was covered with booths, stages, tents, and the apparatus of popular spectacle. By the mid-18th century, Bartholomew Fair included theatrical performances of a raucous popular kind, puppet shows, freak exhibitions, food and drink stalls, and a general atmosphere of licensed disruption that drew London's working population in large numbers and attracted, from the edges of the crowd, the pickpockets and confidence men and unlicensed traders who followed every large gathering. In the weeks before and after the fair, the Smithfield ground was busy with preparation and dismantling, and during the fair itself, the streets around it, including Cock Lane, would have been filled with the overflow of the crowd. For the rest of the year, and particularly in the winter months, the Smithfield ground returned to its ordinary function as a livestock market, and the fair's temporary geography disappeared. The booths gone, the stages gone, the noise and the crowds gone, leaving only the churned mud of the market ground and caught against a fence post or a brick corner, the occasional remnant of a printed paper, a broadside, or a program, half dissolved by rain. The houses on Cock Lane were by the middle of the 18th century terraced structures of the Georgian period, built in London stock brick. London stock brick is a particular material made from the clay and ballast available within and around the capital, fired in kilns south of the river, and distributed across the building trade of the city in the years of its rapid Georgian expansion. The brick is a pale yellow-gray in color, the gray varying toward a warmer tone where the kiln produced a slightly hotter firing, and toward a cooler, more chalky tone where the firing was lower. In the lamplight of a winter evening on Cock Lane, this brick would have read as a warm amber gray at the lit face nearest the lamp, and as a cooler, indeterminate gray further into the shadows. The texture of the coursework, the regular horizontal bands of mortar between the brick courses, the slight variation in the tone of individual bricks, the occasional darker line where a repair had been made in a different batch, visible only at close range, the whole surface of the wall presenting from a distance as a uniform muted color against which the painted or unpainted woodwork of window frames and doorways stood out in slightly greater contrast. The Georgian terraced house built in this period for the middling sort of tenant, the kind of household that a parish clerk might rent from or rent out a room in, was a structure of 3 or 4 stories above a basement, with a frontage of approximately 15 to 20 feet, stairs rising from the entrance hall to the upper floors, and the principal rooms divided from one another by timber-framed internal walls, finished with plaster on the face side. Across the lower portion of the internal walls, and sometimes extending to the full height of the room, ran the wainscoting, panels of painted timber fitted on a frame of lighter battens attached to the wall, their face side presenting to the room as a smooth painted surface, and their backside creating, between the panel and the underlying wall, a cavity of variable depth. In a well-built house on a well-maintained street, this cavity might be only an inch or two deep, the battens packed tight, and the plaster behind them smooth and even. In a house that had settled on its foundations over several decades, as the houses on Cock Lane had, the cavity might be deeper at some points, shallower at others, irregular in its depth, and in the density of the air it enclosed. This cavity, the space between the face of the wainscoting and the brick or plaster of the wall behind it, is worth attending to for a moment, because it is one of those architectural facts that structures the experience of living in a building in ways its occupants may not consciously register. Sound moves through a building by several routes, through the air of the rooms, through the structural fabric of the walls and floors, and through the enclosed cavities within that fabric, where a relatively unobstructed air column allows certain frequencies to travel with less attenuation than they would encounter passing through solid material. The hollow space behind a wainscoting panel is connected, in a building of this kind, to similar hollow spaces in the floors and ceilings, to the gaps around pipe runs and stair stringers, to the spaces between the internal frame of one wall and the next. Sound introduced into this network at any point, a mouse in the cavity behind the first floor bedroom wainscoting, a timber member contracting in the cold, a loose panel flexing under the change in temperature between daytime and the small hours of the night, could emerge from that network at any other point, at a remove from its source, apparently localized in a part of the building where no obvious cause was present. This is not a peculiarity of Cock Lane houses specifically. It is a general property of timber-frame domestic architecture of the period. Any house built on these principles, with this combination of structural materials, would have behaved in essentially this way. Sounds traveled through the fabric, their apparent origin, to a person sitting or lying in a room, could be displaced from their actual origin by several feet, or by the distance between one room and another on the same floor, or between one floor and the next. A person lying awake in a bedroom in a house of this construction, listening in the small hours of a winter night, when the street outside was quiet and the drover noise from Smithfield had stilled, would have heard the building around them as a place in which sound had no fixed address, a contraction in the timber, a settling in the brickwork, a pipe or board or panel cooling at a different rate from the material around it. These sounds would have arrived without preamble and without obvious cause, and they would have seemed, to the ear trying to locate them, to come from a place that the available explanations did not quite account for. Richard Parsons occupied this particular set of circumstances in 1762 as the parish clerk of St. Sepulchre, without Newgate, a church of considerable size and age, standing at the junction of Newgate Street and the Old Bailey, approximately 100 yards south of his Cock Lane house. The church of St. Sepulchre had been substantially rebuilt following the Great Fire of 1666, and was, in the mid-18th century, one of the larger parish churches in the city of London, its tower visible above the rooflines of the surrounding streets, its bells audible across a considerable distance. The parish clerk's position at such a church was a recognized clerical office that carried with it a modest stipend, supplemented by fees for specific duties, assisting at burials, maintaining registers, managing the practical administration of services and the fabric of the building, and a degree of local status appropriate to a man of the lower professional class. Parsons would have been known in the neighborhood. He would have been a recognizable figure in the streets between his house and the church, a man with a defined role in the institutional life of the parish, his position modest but legible. The interior of St. Sepulchre on a weekday morning would have been largely empty. The great space of the nave, the high ceiling above, the rows of box pews below, the floor of stone flags worn smooth by 2 centuries of foot traffic since the rebuilding, quiet in a way that the surrounding streets were not. The parish clerk's duties brought him into this space at hours when few others were present, checking the registers, preparing for forthcoming services, attending to small matters of maintenance or correspondence that the church's regular functioning required. The church was cold in winter, its stone fabric slow to warm even when a fire was maintained in the vestry, and the footsteps of a single person moving between the pews would have been clearly audible in the long reverberant space, each step returning from the walls and ceiling as a distinct secondary sound, the echo lagging just behind the step that caused it. In a building this size, a person moving quietly through the nave would have been accompanied by the sound of their own movement rendered unfamiliar, slightly displaced, arriving back to them from a distance. The ward of Farringdon within, in which Cock Lane sat, was one of the 26 historic wards of the City of London, its boundaries following the lines of medieval administration through a district that by the 18th century was densely built and densely populated. The population of this part of London in the 1760s was drawn predominantly from the working and trading classes who serviced the meat market and the surrounding commercial life of Smithfield, butchers who had their shops and stalls along the market's perimeter, drovers and the auxiliary trades that supported them, the landlords and publicans and shopkeepers who catered to the daily needs of the market workers. And at the fringes of this economy, the parish officials and minor professional men, like Parsons, whose positions in the institutional life of the neighborhood placed them one step above the market trade in terms of social standing, though not always in terms of income. The Old Bailey Courthouse sat at the south end of the lanes connecting streets, its presence a constant geographical fact of the neighborhood, though in 1762 it was not yet the building that would be constructed on that site in later decades. The court that stood there in the mid-18th century was an older structure, open at its side to allow the air to circulate around the proceedings within, a practical consideration in an era before ventilation systems, prompted by the recurrence of jail fever among those attending court from the adjacent Newgate prison. Newgate prison itself stood a very short distance from Cock Lane, its outer wall running along Newgate Street, its presence felt in the neighborhood through the noise of its population, the comings and goings of its administration, and on the days of public execution, the crowds that gathered on the street outside. The gallows at Tyburn had been the traditional site of execution for London's condemned, but by the 1760s executions were increasingly carried out at Newgate itself. In front of the prison, with the crowds these events attracted spreading into the surrounding streets, including Newgate Street, and for the duration of those mornings, into the lower end of Cock Lane. The watchmen who patrolled London's streets at night in this period were parish employees, not members of any organized police force. The Metropolitan Police would not be established for another several decades, and their authority and effectiveness varied considerably from parish to parish and individual to individual. The Farringdon within watch would have covered the streets around Cock Lane on a rota, carrying a lantern and, conventionally a staff and a rattle for raising alarm in the event of an incident. The watchman's primary function was presence rather than intervention. The visible movement of a lantern through the streets at regular intervals, signaling that the parish was maintaining some oversight of what occurred in its public spaces after dark. A watchman on his round along Newgate Street at 11 o'clock on a winter night, turning the corner of Cock Lane, briefly to look north into the dark passage of the lane, checking the doors of the houses visible in the range of his lantern before continuing on his circuit, would have heard the distant sounds of the Smithfield overnight trade, carrying faintly on the cold air from the north the low calls of drovers, the sound of animals moving on stone, the occasional voice from the direction of the market. These sounds were the ordinary ambient life of the district. They were the sounds that constituted the particular quiet of this neighborhood, as distinct from the particular quiet of other London neighborhoods in the same hour. The distance between St. Sepulchre, without Newgate, and the Cock Lane house was something that Richard Parsons covered regularly in both directions across the years of his tenure as parish clerk. It was a walk of no more than 3 or 4 minutes on a clear day. The route took him out of Cock Lane at its southern end onto Newgate Street and a short distance east to the church. In the winter, it was a walk made in cold air, the street relatively empty in the early morning, the church visible ahead with its tower above the roofline, the sound of the street life beginning to build as the day progressed, the market traffic from the north, the court traffic from the east, the general commercial traffic of Newgate Street itself, as the hours moved from morning into the working day. What the parish records of St. Sepulchre show of Parsons's tenure as clerk is a series of routine administrative entries, the ordinary documentation of parish life, baptisms, marriages, burials, the maintenance of the fabric, the payment of fees. His position would have been familiar to him in the way that any long-held position becomes familiar, its routines internalized, its demands manageable within the structure of a day that included also the practical necessities of maintaining his Cock Lane household. The house he rented, partly for his own occupation and partly as a source of supplementary income through the lodging of tenants. The modest income of a parish clerk's position, supplemented by fees and by rental income from lodgers, would have kept a household in modest comfort, though not beyond the reach of financial strain, if circumstances required. The Cock Lane house itself, considered as a building among the other buildings of its row, would not have been remarkable in any aspect visible from the street. Its brick front, its painted door, its windows with their timber frames and small panes of glass, its chimney stacks rising above the parapet at the roofline, all of these were the standard features of the standard Georgian terraced house of the middling sort, repeated along the length of the lane and throughout the surrounding streets in a visual consistency that made the individual house identifiable only by its door number or its position in the row, not by any distinguishing architectural feature. The door would have been closed for most of the day, except when someone was passing through it. The windows on the ground floor would have been shuttered at night. The windows on the upper floors, where the bedrooms were, might have shown a faint light through their shutters in the evening hours when a candle was burning in the room behind them, and then no light at all after the household retired. A person standing at the corner of Cock Lane and Newgate Street on a winter evening in 1762 and looking north into the lane would have seen what any such person would have seen in any of the adjacent streets: the brick fronts of the houses, the dark doors, the few lit windows, the lamp at the corner casting its circle of yellow-gray light on the wet stone of the road, and beyond the reach of that circle, The receding dark of the lane, where the houses continued, but became only shapes, only the suggestion of walls and windows and doors that the lamp could not reach. The lamp's light did not travel far. It was not designed to travel far. It was designed to mark the corner and to make the immediate vicinity of the corner navigable for pedestrians, and this it did. Past its immediate radius, the lane was what the lanes of this part of London were, in the hours after sundown, dark, quiet in the particular way of a place where the ambient sounds of the city were present, but the visual field was heavily contracted, the stone and brick and timber of the buildings fading into a general grayness that dissolved into dark at no very great distance. Inside the houses of Cock Lane, in the first floor rooms where the wainscoting ran along the walls beneath the window line, the timber panels stood in their frames, in the way that timber panels in houses of this age and construction always stood, slightly irregular at the edges where the frame had moved, slightly hollow to the touch in the middle, where the panel met, no backing surface, the paint on the face slightly ridged along the grain of the wood. If a person in such a room pressed their palm flat against the panel, they would have felt the slight give of the timber, the slight vibration of the panel in its frame. If there was any wind outside, the faint temperature difference between the painted wood face, which was at room temperature, and the cold that came from the brick behind the cavity. A coldness felt not directly, because the cavity insulated against direct transfer, but as a general coolness that the panel itself carried, having been in proximity to that cold air for the full length of the winter night. The gap behind the panel, 2 inches, perhaps 3 in some sections, 1.5 inches in others where the battens were thicker or the plaster had swelled, was dark in the way that enclosed spaces within walls are dark. Absolutely, uniformly dark, with no gradation and no source of light. The brick of the wall behind, visible only in the imagination of the person who knew the construction of the building and could place themselves in thought within that narrow dark interval. The timber of the panel separated this darkness from the lit room on one side, and the cold brick of the wall from the other. Between these two surfaces in the gap, the air was still, unless something moved it. The sounds of the house, the step on the floorboard above, the voice in the room below, the fire settling in the grate on the floor beneath that, entered this cavity by the roots that sound takes through structures built this way, arriving in the dark interval behind the wainscoting, from no particular direction, their source indeterminate, their quality slightly altered by the journey through wood and plaster and brick. In a house built this way, on a street this quiet after dark, with the oil lamp's light giving out 20 feet north of the corner, and the watchman's rounds bringing a lantern along Newgate Street at hourly intervals, and no more. In a house with these walls, these panels, this cavity between the painted timber and the cold brick behind it, almost any sound might seem to come from somewhere that the ear could not quite determine. A person lying in the first-floor bedroom on a winter night, the house settled, and the street outside in its particular cold quiet, would have heard the building around them in the way that buildings of this kind make themselves heard, not as silence, but as a distributed, sourceless presence, sounds arriving from no obvious place, occupying the walls and the floor and the panels of the wainscoting, as if the fabric of the structure were itself gently, continuously in motion. The crack of a cooling timber, the flex of a board, the faint rattle of a panel in a draught that found its way through the brick from outside. All of this was the ordinary sound of the house in the cold hours after dark. Where, exactly, any particular sound was coming from, that was another question, and in a house built this way, it was not always a question with a simple answer. William Kent, and Fanny Lyons arrived at the Cock Lane house carrying what any two people carry when they move into rented rooms: the practical weight of ordinary life, the trunks and bundled linens, the small items wrapped in cloth that take up more space in transit than they will in any room. They eventually settle into. The staircase was narrow, the house was modest. The rooms they had come to occupy were on the first floor, above the street, with a window that looked out over the lane's close run of rooftops and chimneys. There was nothing about the arrival that distinguished it from any other tenancy, beginning on any other London street in the early months of 1758. The parish of St. Sepulchre, without Newgate, was a working district. Its streets were occupied by tradespeople, by small merchants, by the kind of men who kept accounts in modest ledgers and paid rent on the first of the month, and had modest debts owing in one direction or another at almost any given time. Kent was a Norfolk-born man who had come to London and made himself useful in the world of stockbroking, which in the mid-18th century was a trade requiring a certain careful temperament, a readiness to sit with numbers, to correspond with merchants and factors, to follow the movement of money across distances. He was not a wealthy man. He was a man who had found a footing in a city that made footings difficult, and he had come to Cock Lane because the rooms were available and the price was what he could meet. Richard Parsons, for his part, was a man of the parish in the specific institutional sense. He held the position of parish clerk at St. Sepulchre without Newgate, which meant he occupied a role that was partly administrative and partly ceremonial. He kept the records, assisted at services, managed the clerical business of a large church that stood at the junction of Newgate Street and the Old Bailey. The income from this position was regular, but not generous. It covered necessities and left little beyond them. He had taken to renting rooms in his Cock Lane house to supplement what the parish paid, which was a common enough arrangement in a district where space was at a premium and the population pressed closely together on every available street. The two men, then, the stockbroker from Norfolk and the parish clerk of Smithfield, met in the practical relationship of lodger and landlord. Kent occupied the first-floor rooms. Parsons occupied the rest of the house, with his family around him, his position at the church giving him what structure the weeks had. There was initially no reason to think this arrangement would be anything other than what it appeared: a man with rooms to let, a man who needed rooms, and the ordinary transaction that brought them together under one roof. Fanny Lyons' position in the household was more complicated, and it is worth pausing to understand what that complication consisted of, because it is a fact the case would later turn upon in several directions at once. She was the sister of Elizabeth Lyons, a woman Kent had been legally married to, and who had died before he came to London. When Elizabeth died, Kent and Fanny had continued together, not as a married couple, which English law would not have permitted, but as partners in what was then called a common law union. The prohibition was specific. A man could not marry the sister of a deceased wife. Whether this law reflected a genuine moral position or simply the institutional logic of inheritance and property, it was clear enough in its effect. Kent and Fanny Lyons were, in the eyes of the law, in a relationship that could not be formalized. They lived together nonetheless, and when they came to Cock Lane, they came together as a household and were received as such. There was a quality to their situation that anyone paying close attention would have noticed, and then, perhaps quietly, not remarked upon. They were not concealing anything, exactly, but they occupied a social position that had no clean name, and in a close-packed parish where the clerk of the local church was the man collecting rent from them every quarter, The absence of a clean name for their arrangement was not something that dissolved simply because no one mentioned it. It sat there like most unresolved social facts, and everyone in the household knew it was there, and life continued around it. Kent kept his ledger. Fanny managed the rooms. The house on Cock Lane went on as houses do, with its seasons of quiet and its seasons of occupation, the daily noise of Smithfield rising and falling outside the first floor window, the sound of livestock and trade, and the ordinary human business of a district built around commerce. In the mornings, Kent would have gone out to conduct his work, moving through the lanes toward the city's financial districts, returning in the afternoons or evenings to the narrow street and the rooms above the lane. In the evenings, the house settled into its domestic routine. There was nothing yet to distinguish it. Richard Parsons had a daughter named Elizabeth. She was approximately 10 or 11 years old when the household at Cock Lane was configured in the way described here. A child of the house in the way that children of such houses always were, present in rooms, moving through corridors, aware of the adults around her, in the particular half-attentive way that children absorb the texture of the world they live in without necessarily being admitted to any formal understanding of it. She would have known Kent and Fanny by sight and by voice, as lodgers in the family house, as the people whose footsteps sounded on the ceiling of the rooms below when they moved around the floor above. She would have heard their conversations imperfectly, through floorboards and internal walls, the way sounds travel in a timber-framed house, present but not fully legible, the low murmur of adult life, arriving from somewhere just out of reach. The first-floor bedroom where Kent and Fanny lived was the room that would later become the center of everything. In those first months, though, it was simply a rented room with its wooden wainscoting along one wall, its modest furnishings, its window giving onto the lane. Fanny would have sat in that room through the afternoons of 1758 and 1759, and the house would have been quiet around her on the days when the street outside was quiet, and noisier on the days when Smithfield's trade pressed closer to the lane. She was not, by the accounts that survive, a woman who drew particular attention to herself. She was simply present in the way that the people closest to us often are, simply there, part of the daily fabric, not yet a figure in any story larger than the ordinary one of a household in a London parish going about its life. The debt between Kent and Parsons came into being at some point during this period of ordinary cohabitation. The precise occasion is not clearly documented, but the sum has been recorded with some consistency, 11 to 12 pounds, lent by Kent to his landlord. The amount was not trivial. For a parish clerk whose income was supplemented by fees and rental income, but who never appears to have been more than modestly comfortable, 12 pounds represented something substantial, several weeks' earnings, or more. For Kent, who was lending it, the sum was presumably manageable, though it was also presumably expected to return. The mechanics of such a loan between a landlord and his lodger are not difficult to reconstruct. Parsons had needed money. Kent had it available. They were living under the same roof, connected by the daily fact of shared space, and the kind of request that would have been awkward between strangers was somewhat more natural between two men who passed each other on the stairs and shared the irregular intimacy of adjacent domestic lives. The money changed hands, counted out on a table, or passed in a folded packet, or transferred in whatever form suited both of them, and Parsons undertook to repay it. The precise terms are not known. What is known is that the repayment did not come. There is something worth dwelling on in the specific texture of an unpaid debt between people who continue to share a roof. It is not the same as a debt between people who then part ways and return to their separate lives. When debtor and creditor go on living in adjacent rooms, the fact of what is owed hangs in the air of the shared spaces between them. Every interaction carries it, faintly, in the background. Pearson's, passing Kent on the stairs, or collecting his quarterly rent, would have been aware of the £12. Kent, handing over his rent and receiving no indication that the earlier sum was being settled, would have been aware of it too. Neither man apparently pressed the matter to any resolution. The debt simply continued, unresolved, while the house went on around it. Fanny Lyons became ill in the early weeks of 1760. The illness was smallpox, one of the most common and most deadly diseases of 18th century London, a disease that moved through the city's crowded parishes with a regularity that made it a background condition of urban life rather than an unexpected catastrophe. She was confined to the first-floor bedroom, which became, during her illness, a closed place. The door kept shut, the room set apart from the rest of the household, as was the standard practice when the disease was present. The house would have become quiet in a different way from its ordinary quietness. Not the quiet of an empty house or an uneventful afternoon, but the particular quiet of a house where illness has imposed its own order, where the normal patterns of movement and noise have reorganized themselves around a sick room. Kent was present during this period. Whatever the legal ambiguity of his relationship with Fanny, he was there, in the house on Cock Lane, through the weeks of her illness. The precise quality of those weeks, the care given, the fear held, the practical management of a severe illness in a small rented room in a Smithfield parish, is not something the documentary record preserves in detail. What it preserves is the outcome. Fanny Lyons died in January 1760 in the first-floor bedroom of the house at Cock Lane of smallpox. She was young. The death was not unexpected in the sense that smallpox in its severe form was frequently fatal, but it was the kind of death that leaves a specific shape in the space where a person was. After her death, Kent left Cock Lane. His reasons were practical. A man whose partner had just died of a contagious disease in a rented room had reasons enough to move on, and the rooms themselves would now have carried everything that rooms carry after a death, the particular changed quality of a space that has been a sick room and is now simply a room again. He took his ledger and his correspondence and his Norfolk practicality and went to arrange his life elsewhere. The house on Cock Lane returned to the Parsons family's sole occupation. The first-floor bedroom, cleared of Fanny's belongings, became once again a room available for other uses. Elizabeth Parsons, now approximately 11 years old, was growing up in a house that had recently contained a death. This was not unusual for a London child of the period. Death moved through the city's households with the same unremarkable regularity as illness, and children of working families were rarely shielded from its proximity. But there is something particular about a room in which someone has died that continues to function as a room, to be entered and used and sat in, while still carrying the memory of its recent history. Elizabeth would have known that Fanny had died in the first-floor room. The house was small enough that there were no rooms distant enough from that knowledge to be truly separate from it. In the period after Kent's departure, and before the events that would later draw London's attention to the Cock Lane address, the household settled back into its ordinary shape. Parsons going to St. Sepulchre without Newgate for his clerical duties, the children of the family occupying the house through the days, the quarterly rents arriving from new lodgers if any came, the street outside maintaining its seasonal patterns of trade and noise. The £12 that Kent had lent were still outstanding. They had not been returned before he left, and there is no evidence that they were returned in the months following his departure. The debt moved from being a tension within a shared domestic space to being an obligation that simply existed at a distance between two men who no longer shared a roof. William Kent did not disappear from the neighborhood entirely. He remained within the general vicinity of the Smithfield district, maintaining his business dealings, and at some point he began to seek legal redress for the outstanding loan. The precise timeline of his attempts to recover the money is not fully documented, but the pattern is clear enough. Parsons owed, Kent wanted repayment, and the ordinary machinery of financial recovery between men of modest means in Georgian London was not a swift or reliable instrument. The situation was unresolved. It is worth pausing here at this point in the story's chronology and looking at the household at Cock Lane, not as a collection of people who would shortly become figures in a famous case, but simply as they were. Parsons was a parish clerk with insufficient income and an outstanding debt he had not managed to settle. His daughter Elizabeth was a child in the house where a woman had recently died. Kent was a stockbroker in Norfolk who had come to London, lost his partner, and found himself unable to recover a loan from the man he had rented rooms from. Mary Fraser, who would later become the voice of the seances, the woman who spoke questions into the dark room and relayed the knocking entity's responses to assembled audiences, was not yet part of the story in any documented way. She would come later, when the public performance had already begun to take shape. These were ordinary people in recognizable circumstances, the debtor and the creditor, the father and the child, the grieving man who left his lodgings and carried on with his life, the woman who died in a rented room in January of a bad winter. The circumstances were not unusual. The combination of them in that particular house, with that particular debt outstanding, and that particular child growing up in the rooms, was the specific arrangement from which everything that followed would emerge. The relationship between Parsons and Kent was not one of outright hostility, at least not in any documented form. There is no surviving letter in which Parsons expresses hatred for his former lodger, no account in which Kent describes Parsons as an enemy. What there was, instead, was the quieter and more persistent condition of an unresolved obligation between two men of unequal standing who had spent time under the same roof and then gone their separate ways without settling what was between them. The 12 pounds sat at the edge of every other fact in this story, not as a dramatic grievance, but as a small and stubborn one, the kind that does not announce itself, but does not disappear either. The house on Cock Lane itself had not changed. From outside, on an ordinary afternoon in 1760 or 1761, its modest brick front was indistinguishable from the houses on either side of it. The door was closed. The street ran its short length from Newgate Street toward West Smithfield, carrying its usual traffic of tradespeople and passers-by. Nothing about the building's exterior indicated that it contained anything of particular interest. It was a modest terraced house in a working parish, the kind of house that exists in thousands across a city, that is lived in and rented out and passed through by people who leave it largely unchanged. The front step was worn. The window glass held the gray light of a winter afternoon. Inside, the wooden wainscoting ran along the wall of the first-floor bedroom, and behind it, in the gap between the timber panel and the cold brick, the hollow dark was simply there, as it had always been, carrying sound without announcing it. Elizabeth Parsons, approaching the age of 12, was the child of this house. She had lived in it through the arrival of the lodgers and the illness of Fanny and the departure of Kent and the settling back of the household into its ordinary patterns. She had listened as children in narrow houses always listen, to the sounds coming through walls and floors and ceilings, the half-heard conversations, the footsteps in rooms above and below, the sounds the house made in the night when the street outside was quiet and the timber contracted in the cold. She knew the sounds of this particular house. She knew which boards creaked and which walls carried sound, and which rooms were closest to the street noise and which were quietest after dark. This is the kind of knowledge a child accumulates in a house without ever being taught it, simply by being present over time in the particular acoustics of a particular place. The first floor bedroom was the room she knew the way any child knows the most significant room of their particular childhood, not abstractly, but in the bodily accumulated way of having spent time in it, having heard it at different hours, having slept in it and sat in it and listened to it settle at night. Fanny Linz had slept in that room during her final illness. Kent had slept there before that through the months of the tenancy, while his ledger sat open on the desk and the sounds of Smithfield rose through the window. Elizabeth would have known the room's particular quality of silence when the house was quiet. She would have known what sounds it made when the wind was off the north, or when the temperature dropped below freezing, or when the timber of the wainscoting expanded and contracted through the night. In the months before the events the case is built upon, these were simply the unremarkable facts of an ordinary domestic life. The parish clerk went to his church. The child went about the business of childhood. The street ran its length from Newgate to Smithfield and back again, as it had for centuries. The oil lamp at the corner cast its limited light onto the brick, and beyond its reach the lane was dark, and the house stood in that darkness without announcement. Its door closed, its window dark, its wainscoting holding the silence of the rooms behind it. Kent, meanwhile, continued to pursue the recovery of his loan. Whether he wrote letters, whether he spoke to Parsons directly, whether he engaged a third party to negotiate on his behalf, the specific mechanics of his attempts are not fully preserved in the documentary record. What the record preserves is the overall shape of the situation. The money had been lent, the repayment had not come, and the man who had lent it had not received what he was owed. This was not an unusual situation in Georgian London, where credit between individuals of modest means was the ordinary lubricant of daily commerce, and the failure to repay was a common and frequently unresolved event. But the particular circumstances of this debt, the shared roof, the death in the house, the departure, the ongoing connection between the two men, through the geography of the same district, gave it a texture that a more impersonal financial obligation would not have had. Parsons' position at St. Sepulchre without Newgate continued through this period without obvious disruption. He attended to his clerical duties, kept the parish records, assisted at the services of a large and well-attended church. His position in the parish gave him a kind of social standing that was not commensurate with his income. The parish clerk was a recognized figure, a man of some institutional presence, even if the institutional presence was modest, and the income modest to match. He was known in the district. He had neighbors and acquaintances, and the ordinary network of a man who has lived in one place long enough to be recognized on the street. It is in this context, the parish clerk with his insufficient income and his outstanding debt, the child of the house growing up in its close rooms, the former lodger somewhere in the district, with £12 still owed to him, that the events of 1762 would be set. Not by any dramatic rupture in the household circumstances, not by any single event that changed everything at once, but by the slow accumulation of circumstances that had been present for years. Waiting in the quiet of the first floor bedroom and the unresolved accounts between two men who had shared a roof and a small, stubborn financial obligation, and nothing else. Mary Fraser's role in what followed was that of the interpreter, the woman who would stand in the room and speak questions into the relative dark and relay whatever the knocking code produced to the assembled audiences. How she came to occupy this position and what her relationship to the Parsons household was in the period before the public events began is not fully documented. She appears in the historical record primarily in her function as questioner, as communicative interface, as the voice that gave the performances their shape, rather than as a figure whose prior history is extensively recorded. That she was present, and that her presence was organized, is established. The precise path by which she arrived at that function belongs to the period just after the one this part of the story occupies. The Cock Lane house, then, held these people and these facts in the years between the lodger's arrival and the events that would make the address famous. A landlord who owed money he had not repaid. A child growing up in the rooms of a house where a death had recently occurred. A former lodger somewhere in the city carrying the unresolved weight of an outstanding loan. A first-floor bedroom with its painted wainscoting and its hollow gap between the timber and the cold brick. An ordinary London street that ran its short course from Newgate to Smithfield, unremarkable from outside, carrying no visible sign of the arrangements within it. These were the materials, not dramatic materials by any ordinary measure. The debt was small, as debts go. The people were not figures of consequence or notoriety. The house was indistinguishable from its neighbors. The child was simply a child in a house where children live, absorbing the textures of her surroundings in the particular quiet way that children absorb things before they understand them. But it was from exactly these materials, modest, ordinary, unremarkable, that the case would be made. The £12 lent and not repaid. The woman who died in January and was buried and left no documentation of her illness beyond the parish record. The child who knew the sounds of the house the way only a child who has lived long in a place can know them. The wainscoting, with its hollow dark behind it, carrying sound in ways that could not always be precisely traced to their source. Most of what would follow in the loud and crowded months of 1762 can be traced back through the sequence of events to that one small, unresolved financial fact, the morning when coins were counted out on a table, passed between two men of unequal standing in the quiet of a Smithfield house, and never returned. The scratching came from behind the wall. That much was consistent across accounts. Not from beneath the floorboards, not from within the chimney, not from any of the other places a sound might reasonably travel in an 18th century London house of timber and brick. The sound came from behind the wooden panels, the wainscoting that lined the first-floor bedroom of the Cock Lane house, and it was rhythmic, and it was light, and when witnesses attempted to describe it, they reached for comparisons that placed it somewhere between the movement of a small animal and the deliberate tapping of a finger, though neither description quite captured what they heard. Imagine lying in that room in 1759, the house on either side gone quiet, the street outside in its own late-night stillness, the oil lamp at the corner of Newgate Street doing nothing for the dark at this end of the lane, the bed beneath thick enough to keep out the cold, and the room itself not large, 4 walls of plaster and timber, 1 wall carrying the wainscoting panels, a row of painted boards perhaps waist high, their edges meeting the plaster above and the floorboards below. And then, somewhere behind them, the sound begins. It is light enough to wonder if it is nothing. It is persistent enough to keep the wondering going. It does not come from any one panel in particular, or if it does, the listener lying in the bed is not quite certain which one. The hollow nature of the cavity behind the wainscoting, that gap between the timber facing and the cold brick of the outer wall, means the sound distributes itself slightly, arrives with less precise location than a sound made directly in the room would have. A knock against a solid surface lands at a point. A sound within a cavity spreads. This is what the first witnesses at the Cock Lane house reported. A scratching behind the panels of the first floor bedroom wall, persistent, rhythmic, and entirely without obvious source. The date generally given for the beginning of the disturbances is 1759. The house at that time held Richard Parsons, his daughter Elizabeth, and his lodgers William Kent and Fanny Lyons. The sounds in the accounts that were later recorded did not begin all at once. They accumulated, returned, became a feature of the house's nighttime character before they became anything more than that. A sound in the walls of a house in Smithfield would not by itself have drawn much attention. Houses along Cock Lane were old enough to settle, to creak, to harbor mice behind their paneling. The scratching sounds might have been dismissed, might have remained nothing more than a domestic oddity, a topic of brief conversation between landlord and lodger, a thing noticed and then not quite noticed again, except that on at least one early occasion, the conditions under which the sounds appeared were noticed specifically enough to be remembered later. William Kent was absent from the house on the night in question. Fanny Lyons, his common-law partner, was not alone in the first-floor bedroom. Elizabeth Parsons, the parish clerk's daughter, was sharing the bed with her, a common enough arrangement in a house of modest rooms, a practical matter rather than an unusual one. A child sleeping in the room with the lodger while other accommodations were temporarily needed. And it was during this particular night, with Elizabeth present and Kent elsewhere, that the scratching began. The Parsons family would later place considerable weight on this detail. If the sounds could be heard when Kent was absent, and when no adult male member of the household was in the room, then the sounds had no connection to anything Kent had done or failed to do. The sounds preceded him, or at least existed independently of him. They attached to the room, or to the house, or to something the room contained that was not a person. This was the argument the family advanced, and it mattered because of what the sounds would eventually be said to mean. But that came later. In the early period in 1759, in the months before the disturbances became a matter of public record or legal consequence, the scratching was simply something that happened in the house, something that Elizabeth in particular was known to have heard and been disturbed by, something that Richard Parsons mentioned to his neighbors and acquaintances in the way of a man living with an unexplained domestic inconvenience. The wainscoting of the first-floor bedroom produced sounds after dark. No one had yet determined what they were. The sounds changed in character over the months that followed, or the descriptions of them changed, which may or may not be the same thing. What had begun as scratching acquired a companion phenomenon, a hollow knocking, distinct from the lighter scratching sound, as if something within the wall had moved from grazing the timber surface to striking it more deliberately. The two sounds were not always simultaneous. Sometimes the scratching came alone. Sometimes a single knock would arrive after a period of silence, isolated and deliberate in a way that scratching was not. The distinction between the two sounds would become important because it was the knocking, the single, separable, intentional quality of the knock that made a code possible. The code itself was straightforward. One knock for yes, two knocks for no. A method of communication so simple that its simplicity was part of what made it persuasive. No elaborate system, no requirement for anything beyond the ability to count to two. A question was posed aloud into the room. A pause followed. Then either a single knock sounded, confirming the question, or two knocks sounded, denying it, or silence continued for long enough that the question was understood to have been turned aside. And through this exchange, question and knock, the entity that was reported to inhabit the walls of the first floor bedroom was given a voice. Mary Fraser was the figure who conducted these exchanges in the room's more formal sessions. She served as the questioner, the intermediary, the person whose voice shaped the structure of each seance. She would seat herself in the room, the first floor bedroom, where the sounds were most consistently heard, and speak her questions aloud, waiting for the response in the wall, relaying that response to whoever else was present. Her role was an unusual one, occupying a position between the entity and the audience that gave her considerable influence over how the exchange unfolded, what questions were posed, in what order they came, and how the pauses between question and answer were managed. In that position, she was less a witness than a kind of architect of the experience. What the audience heard depended significantly on what Mary Fraser asked. Picture her seated in that room on one of the earlier occasions, before the crowds had begun to gather, when the seances were still a private matter between the household and a small number of interested visitors. The room not large, lit by a single candle, or perhaps by none at all. The darkness said to be part of what the entity preferred, though this claim itself raises questions about what a preference for darkness allowed. Mary Fraser in her chair, a few other figures in the room, standing or seated along the walls, the wainscoting visible as a dark line of panels along the near wall, their painted surfaces absorbing rather than reflecting what little light there was, and Fraser's voice, level and deliberate, posing the first question into the quiet room. The question would have been simple at first, something establishing, something that asked the entity to confirm its presence or to signal that it was attending before anything more consequential was asked. A single knock for yes, a pause, a single knock arriving from somewhere within the timber and brick, the people in the room hearing it, confirming to one another in low voices that they had heard it too, and then returning their attention to Fraser for the next question. The sessions built incrementally. What the entity was first asked to confirm was basic, that there was something present, that it could hear, that it was willing to respond. Then, as these preliminary confirmations accumulated, the questions moved toward identity. Was this a spirit? A single knock. Yes. Was this the spirit of someone who had lived? Yes. Was this someone known to the household? Yes, again, or that is what the accounts record. And then the more particular questions, the ones that turned the session from a general inquiry into a specific one, the questions that narrowed the identity toward a name that everyone in the room already half expected to hear. The spirit identified through the knocking code, through the patient accumulation of yes and no responses over the course of several sessions, was Fanny Lynes. Fanny Lynes had died in the house on Cock Lane in January 1760, approximately a year before the case reached its public peak. She had died of smallpox. This was the documented medical account of her death, the cause recorded at the time, the explanation her illness and its progression pointed to. The disease had kept the household at a distance during her final days, her room a closed place, the house quiet around it in the particular way that a house becomes quiet when it is waiting on an outcome it cannot speed along. She had died and been buried, and the house had continued without her. But the entity behind the wainscoting, speaking through its binary code in Mary Fraser's sessions, was not prepared to accept this account of events. The questions moved forward carefully. Had the spirit died peacefully? 2 knocks? No. Had the spirit died of the illness attributed to her? 2 knocks? No. Had something else contributed to her death? A pause. Then 1 knock? Yes. And from there the sessions moved into territory considerably more serious than a domestic haunting. Through the knocking code, through the slow accumulation of yes and no responses across a series of questions that Fraser posed and the room's occupants witnessed, the entity that called itself Fanny Lyons made a specific claim. It had not died of smallpox. It had been deliberately poisoned. The substance named was red arsenic. The method was a purgative drink, and the person named as responsible for administering that drink, through the sequential narrowing of questions that ruled out other possibilities and arrived at a single candidate, was William Kent. The specific contained the sound of a single knock in a room full of people waiting for it, does something that no general disturbance can quite replicate. The scratching sounds, the hollow knocking in the walls, were impressive in their own way, persistent, sourceless, resistant to obvious explanation. But they were not language. They did not say anything in themselves. They were noise. The binary code transformed noise into communication, and communication, however simple the mechanism, carries implications that noise does not. When a single knock sounded in response to the question of whether William Kent had poisoned Fanny Lyons, it was not simply a sound from a wall. It was an accusation, a specific allegation against a named living person, produced through a method that the people in the room had just accepted as valid. The gradual construction of this accusation across multiple sessions should be held clearly in view. It did not arrive all at once. No single evening produced the complete claim. The binary code structure meant that the murder accusation was built piece by piece, question by question, knock by knock, across a series of sessions that each added one small element to the larger shape that was forming. This incremental quality made the accusation more persuasive than a sudden revelation would have been. Each step felt confirmed by the audience that witnessed it before the next step was taken, so that by the time the completed accusation stood before them, it rested on a foundation of individually witnessed confirmations, each one small, each one seemingly solid. Those present in the room during the sessions were not all credulous, and they were not all easily misled. Some were neighbors and tradespeople, people with ordinary practical experience of the world, not obviously given to fancy. Some were clergymen and professional men with habits of mind shaped by careful inquiry. The sessions drew a range of observers, and among them were people genuinely attempting to assess what they were witnessing. The question they were working with was the question that the knocking code itself posed. If the sounds in the wall were real, and witnesses agreed that sounds were audible, then what was producing them? The interpretation the Parsons household offered was available and structured, and through the code, capable of engaging with questions rather than simply asserting itself. It was, from the perspective of someone in that room in 1762, not an obviously absurd thing to take seriously while waiting to see what the investigation would eventually establish. The claims accumulating through the sessions were specific enough to be checked. This was one of the unusual features of the Cock Lane case. Not that an allegation was made, but that the allegation was precise. A named victim, a named substance, a named method, a named perpetrator. These were claims that could be examined against the known record of Fanny Lynn's death, against the circumstances of William Kent's presence in the house, against the medical evidence of her illness. Specificity was, in one sense, a vulnerability. A general accusation cannot be proven false. A specific one can be tested. William Kent, for his part, was a real man living in London, conducting his affairs as a stockbroker, and now the subject of a murder accusation, being communicated through a knocking wall in a house in Smithfield. The accusation was reaching beyond the room where the seances were held. Word of what the entity had claimed was moving through the neighborhood, and as the sessions drew larger audiences, through rather broader circles than that. Kent's position was straightforwardly difficult. A dead woman's spirit, speaking through a code, had named him as her poisoner. The claim had the attention of crowds. It had been witnessed by enough people in enough separate sessions that it could not easily be dismissed as a single observer's misreporting. The sessions continued. The character of the phenomena during this period was not consistent across all accounts. The scratching sounds were most reliably reported from the first floor bedroom, the original location, the wainscoted wall, the gap behind the panels, the darkness within the building's fabric from which the sounds had always seemed to come. But some witnesses reported the sounds appearing to move, tracking Elizabeth Parsons as she moved through the house, present wherever she was, rather than fixed to one room. Whether this reflected genuine experience, selective attention, or something about the way accounts were shaped in retrospect is not easy to determine from the surviving record. What the accounts preserve is the impression, the sense that the sounds were not confined to a single location, but extended through the house, through the walls, through the fabric of the building itself, following the child who was their most consistent witness. Elizabeth at this period was around 11 or 12 years old. She had lived in the house through Fanny Lindsay's illness and death. She had been present in the bedroom on the early nights when the scratching first drew attention. She was the figure whom witnesses most consistently described as physically affected by the disturbances, pale, distressed, apparently in real discomfort during seances. Her behavior in the room making an impression on observers that pure theater would have required some skill to manufacture in a child of that age. Those who attended the sessions and later wrote about them often mentioned her specifically, noting the apparent genuineness of her reactions, the absence of the calculated quality that conscious performance tends to carry. The wainscoting itself drew examination. Early visitors to the house, curious about the physical mechanism behind the sounds, would approach the panels and examine them, running hands along the edges, knocking on the painted surface with a knuckle to hear the hollow sound the cavity behind produced, looking for gaps or openings through which a person might reach or a device might be concealed. The panels of a Georgian wainscoting were not complex objects. They were lengths of timber cut and fitted together, their edges joined to the plaster and to each other, their painted surface covering the grain of the wood beneath. When tapped, they sounded hollow, the cavity behind them responding to the knock with a resonance slightly broader and less precise than the sound of knuckle against solid wall would produce. A visitor in this period who rapped the wainscoting panel and heard it ring hollow was receiving, in a sense, the central acoustic fact of the entire case. The hollow gap behind the panel, the 2 or 3 inches of dark air between timber face and cold brick, was precisely the space within which the sounds seemed to originate. Not above it, not below it, not from the room adjacent, but from within the building's own fabric, from the unlit cavity that the eye could not reach and the hand could not easily enter. The examination confirmed the hollow space. What it could not confirm or deny was what made the hollow space produce sounds. The sessions with Mary Fraser and the knocking code were by this point drawing visitors who were not simply curious neighbors. People of some standing were attending. Clergymen with an interest in questions of the afterlife and the soul's persistence. Professional men whose social position gave them access to the house and whose eventual accounts of what they witnessed would carry weight in the broader public discussion. The sessions had acquired a kind of institutional form, a time, a room, a method, a questioner that made attendance feel like participation in a structured inquiry rather than a simple visit to a show. This institutional quality lent the events a gravity they might not have sustained if they had remained informal. It was within this structure, the darkened room, the assembled witnesses, Mary Fraser in her position as questioner, the wainscoting panel along the wall, that the completed murder accusation eventually stood in full view. The entity had identified itself. It had given its name. It had denied the official cause of death. It had named the substance used against it. It had named the method. It had named the person responsible. And all of this had been produced, not through a voice, not through a vision, not through any of the more traditional apparitional forms of reported communication, but through the simplest possible binary exchange. One knock for yes, two knocks for no, a code so spare that its operation could be followed by anyone in the room, regardless of education or background. The contained quality of that code is worth pausing on. In the first floor bedroom on Cock Lane, in the winter of 1762, with the sounds of Smithfield's nighttime trade, distant below, and the oil lamps on Newgate Street providing no illumination to the upper floors, the accumulated evidence of many sessions came down to this. A room full of people had heard a series of single knocks in response to a series of questions, and through those knocks a name had been named as a murderer. The specificity of the accusation was also, in a precise historical sense, its most consequential feature. Murder accusations in 18th century England were not taken lightly, and a murder accusation supported by the testimony of so many witnesses, however unusual the form of that testimony, was something the legal and social machinery of the period would eventually have to address. Kent was not a silent figure in this. He was present in London, aware of what was being said, and not willing to allow the accusation to stand without challenge. The gathering of serious investigators to examine the case, the formal inquiry that would eventually be organized, with men of standing arriving to sit in the room and assess what they could observe, followed directly from the completed accusation and from Kent's determination that it be examined properly. But before the formal investigation arrived, the seances continued in their own form and rhythm. The room dark, or nearly dark, Mary Fraser seated, her voice steady, the questions following in sequence. The pause after each question, the room's occupants holding the quality of attention that waiting for a sound produces. Not tense exactly, but concentrated, alert to the smallest auditory detail, ready to register a knock that was no louder than a finger tapping a wooden surface once. And the wainscoting panel in the wall that painted timber surface, that hollow-sounding board behind which 2 or 3 inches of dark air separated timber from brick, simply present, there when the questions were asked, there when the answers came, there when the candle was lit afterward and the witnesses compared their accounts of what they had heard, a feature of a room, a practical element of a house's interior construction, a common enough thing in a Georgian terrace of the period, hollow behind the surface, as wainscoting by its nature is, giving back a particular sound when struck, as any hollow cavity does. The accounts from this period agree on the sound itself with a consistency that is one of the more notable features of the case's early record. Witnesses who had no prior connection to one another and who attended the sessions independently described what they heard in terms close enough to suggest they had heard something, a scratching, rhythmic and light, from behind the panels. A knocking, distinct and separable, arriving in response to questions in a way that seemed addressed rather than random. The sounds were real sounds. The question the investigation would eventually address was not whether sounds had been heard, but how they had been made. In the first floor bedroom of the Cock Lane house, on a winter night in 1762, that question had not yet been answered. The wainscoting stood along the wall in the dark. The hollow cavity behind it extended the length of the room, connecting panel to panel, offering the sound no single origin that could be pointed to with certainty. A knock would arrive, and everyone in the room would have heard it, and no one in the room would have been entirely sure of the precise point from which it had come. A scratch, a pause, a single knock. The sessions had taken an unremarkable sound from within a wall, a sound of the kind that old timber-framed houses produce regularly and without meaning, and fitted it with a structure, a vocabulary, and a purpose. They had taken the hollow acoustic property of a wainscoted wall and asked questions of it. They had taken the random interval of a knock and made it mean something. And through this process, patient and incremental across weeks and months, the sounds behind the panels of the first floor bedroom had accumulated into a specific claim that a woman had been murdered, that the method had been arsenic in a drink, and that the man responsible was still alive and living in London. A scratch, 2 or 3 inches of dark air behind a painted timber panel, a system for turning silence and sound into yes and no. These were the materials from which a murder accusation had been constructed, one knock at a time, in the narrow dark of a parish clerk's house on a street running north from Newgate Street toward West Smithfield. The sounds behind the wall had found their meaning. The question of where that meaning had come from, whether from within the wall or from within the room, or from somewhere in the arrangement of people and circumstances that had assembled around the wainscoting in the winter of 1762, was the question that now, with the accusation fully formed and standing in public view, the city of London was beginning to take seriously enough to examine. The sounds themselves had not changed. The scratching was still light. The knock was still a single sound, no louder than a knuckle against wood, but the knocking now carried a name attached to it, and a death, and an allegation, and the attention of anyone in London who had followed the story as it moved from the first-floor bedroom of Cock Lane, out through the neighborhood, and into the periodicals and conversations that carried such things further than a narrow street could hold them. A sound behind a wall, a scratch, and then a pause, and then a knock, and through a simple code, 1 knock for yes, 2 for no. That sequence of small sounds had arrived by the winter of 1762 at the claim that a man had committed murder. Cock Lane on a January evening in 1762 was not a wide street at the best of times, and on the nights when the crowd came, it was barely passable at all. People pressed in from both ends, arriving from Newgate Street to the south and from the direction of West Smithfield to the north, funneling into the narrow passage until the bodies stood close enough that a person near the middle of the lane could feel the warmth of strangers on either side, despite the cold. Lanterns moved in the dark above the crowd, carried lanterns, swinging slightly with each step, casting small irregular pools of light that crossed and merged and separated as people shifted. The house itself stood with its door open, and light came from it too, a steadier, warmer light, the kind of light that meant candles burning in some quantity inside a room that ordinarily would not have been lit so brightly. What the lane held on those nights was not a queue, exactly, and not quite a crowd in the ordinary sense. It was something between the two, people who had arranged themselves toward a point of attention without quite knowing how long they would have to wait, or whether they would be admitted at all. Some had come from the parishes immediately surrounding Smithfield, walking through streets they knew, drawn by a story that had been moving through the neighborhood for weeks. Others had come considerably further, arriving by sedan chair or hired coach from the western parts of the city, from Mayfair and St. James's, their clothes noticeably finer than those of the people standing nearest them. Their reasons for coming perhaps more complicated than simple curiosity, though curiosity was likely among them. The crowd on Cock Lane in early 1762 was by most accounts drawn from a remarkable range of London life, laborers and lace-makers, standing beside lawyers and gentlemen, all of them waiting in the same cold, narrow street for the same uncertain thing. A few among the crowd would have known the history of the house before any of the current stories attached to it. Most would not. The house was a modest terraced property, no different in its exterior from the buildings on either side, its London stock brick darkened with the accumulated soot of the city, its windows lit from within on the evenings the seances were held. The street itself had always been one of the quieter passages in the ward, not quite on the main routes that carried commercial traffic between Newgate Street and the market at Smithfield, but close enough to both that the sounds of the city were always audible at its ends. What it was not in its ordinary state was a place that drew crowds. It was a place people passed through on their way to somewhere else, or lived in because the rents were manageable. It had not been famous before. It was very famous now. The story had begun moving through the city by way of the same channels that all stories of this kind moved in Georgian London. Word of mouth in the first instance, then print. The Public Ledger, a periodical founded only 2 years before these events, was among the first publications to carry sustained accounts of the seances at Cock Lane, printing detailed descriptions of what witnesses reported hearing and seeing in the first-floor bedroom of the house. These accounts were episodic and cumulative, each new report adding to a narrative that readers were already familiar with, and the effect of this over weeks and months was to produce something closer to a developing serial story than a straightforward piece of news. People followed it the way they followed other running narratives in the press, with the particular attention of an audience that already knows the main characters and is waiting to see what happens next. And the story, as stories will, moved from the ledger to competing papers, and from papers to pamphlets, and from pamphlets to broadsides, and from broadsides to the ordinary conversation of people who had not read any of them, but had heard the outlines from someone who had. The broadsides were perhaps the most efficient vehicle. A single printed sheet, sold cheaply on street corners, or pinned to the walls of taverns and coffee houses, could carry enough of the story to give a listener the essential shape of it: a house on Cock Lane, a ghost, a dead woman, a knocking in the walls, and behind the knocking, an accusation. The printers who produced these sheets were working quickly and commercially, setting the type for whatever version of the story would sell, and the result was a body of printed material that varied considerably in its accuracy and in the number of embellishments it had accumulated on its way from the house to the press. The story in print was always somewhat different from the story that had occurred in the house, as stories in print tend to be, but the differences rarely reduced the interest. They often increased it. A printer in a Fleet Street workshop in January of 1762, setting type for the latest installment of the Cock Lane reports, was setting type for something he could be reasonably confident would sell, and the certainty of that commercial fact is itself a measure of how thoroughly the case had embedded itself in the public attention. The famous came too, and their coming was itself reported and discussed. Horace Walpole, who was at this period conducting an extensive private correspondence with friends across England and on the continent, filling letter after letter with the social details of London life, attended a seance at the house on a winter night, and wrote about it with the candid, slightly theatrical tone that made his letters so enjoyable to read. What Walpole reported was not the ghost. The ghost did not perform on the evening he attended. What he reported instead was everything around the absence, the room with its candles, the assembled company, the general sense of collective waiting that settled over a group of people who had all come some distance to hear a sound in a wall and were now sitting in the near dark, listening to nothing. His account describes the atmosphere with a precision that is largely social. He noted who was present. He noted the quality of the expectation in the room. He noted his own departure back into the cold street and the private assessment of the evening that he was already forming as he went. His letters have survived and are among the most vivid primary accounts of what attendance at these seances was actually like, from the perspective of a sophisticated and somewhat skeptical observer who went largely because it was the thing one went to that month. What Walpole's letters also record, beneath the sardonic surface, is that he had gone at all. That fact is its own evidence about the case's reach. Walpole moved in circles where the Cock Lane ghost would have been discussed at considerable length before he troubled himself to visit Cock Lane in person, and a man of his social position did not make nocturnal trips to Smithfield on idle whims. Something about the case had accumulated enough gravity, enough weight of public attention to make the journey seem worth making. He went because London was talking about it, and because a person who had not been, had not fully been part of what London was talking about. The case had become one of those events that function as shared reference points, the kind of event that orients social conversation for a season because everyone has an opinion on it, or has heard someone else's opinion, or intends to form one. Samuel Johnson's involvement was of a different character from Walpole's. Johnson did not go to Cock Lane purely as a social exercise or a piece of fashionable attendance. He went as someone who regarded the question seriously, who held as a deeply religious man that the possibility of genuine supernatural communication was one he could not dismiss without examination, and who held equally, as a careful and empirically minded thinker, that unscrutinized claims deserved precisely the scrutiny they were not always receiving. His attendance at the house was part of a process that eventually led to something more structured, the organization of a formal committee of inquiry, meeting under credible auspices, which Johnson was involved in convening, and whose published findings he had a hand in approving. This was not a casual involvement. Johnson brought to the Cock Lane case the same concentrated attention he brought to questions of evidence and argument in other areas of his intellectual life, which is to say, a great deal of attention, organized with considerable care. That a man of Johnson's standing chose to invest that attention in the Cock Lane ghost is a piece of information that says something worth pausing over. The case was not, from the outside, obviously worthy of his time. It was a domestic disturbance in a modest house in a commercial neighborhood, involving a parish clerk, his young daughter, and a set of knocking sounds in a wall. The people most directly associated with it were not figures of great social consequence, and yet Johnson went and organized others to go with him, and took the investigation seriously enough to be involved in publishing its results. The explanation is something like this. In 1762, the knocking at Cock Lane had not yet been resolved into a simple fraud. It was still an open question. And Johnson's position was that open questions about the boundary between the physical world and whatever lay beyond it were not beneath the notice of serious men. He was not credulous, he was thorough. These are different things. The two men's visits, Walpole's ironically detached, Johnson's methodically earnest, together produced something like a portrait of the range of ways in which educated Georgian London was processing the case. Walpole found it amusing. Johnson found it worth examining. Both of them found it worth attending. The crowd on the street outside was doing something between the two, taking it seriously enough to come, holding it lightly enough to stand in the cold and treat the occasion as an event worth the journey, rather than a matter of private distress. The atmosphere outside the house on the busiest nights was described in contemporary accounts in terms that suggest something closer to a public entertainment than a solemn investigation. Voices lowered, not from reverence, but from collective anticipation, the sort of quiet that descends on a crowd that is listening for something specific and knows it will hear it or not hear it soon. There were street vendors working the crowd on those nights. This detail appears in contemporary accounts without particular emphasis, noted as an ordinary feature of any gathering large enough to attract commercial attention in 18th century London. A crowd of dozens or hundreds was a market of a kind, and wherever such a market formed, there would be people working its edges with something to sell, printed sheets carrying the latest account of the ghost, perhaps, or something to eat or drink in the January cold. The presence of vendors is not an insignificant detail. It marks the point at which a local disturbance becomes something that the economy of the city notices and responds to, the point at which attention translates into commerce. Cock Lane, by early 1762, had passed that threshold. It had become an event in the sense that the city used that word, something that happened at a particular place, at a particular hour, that a person could choose to attend in the way one might choose to attend a performance or a market or a public ceremony. The house at the center of it had not changed. The events inside it had not substantially changed. What had changed was the scale of the city's awareness, and with that awareness had come everything that awareness produces: the press coverage, the famous visitors, the vendors, the crowds, and eventually the satirical response that always accompanies something that has been taken too seriously for too long. The satirical response arrived in print at roughly the same time the investigations were moving toward their conclusions. The nickname Scratching Fanny appeared in pamphlets and conversation. The precise moment of its first appearance in print is difficult to establish with certainty, as with most such coinages, but it was circulating widely enough by mid-1762 to have become the standard shorthand for the case in satirical writing. The name carried a note of mockery that was by this point starting to feel earned, a ghost that communicated by scratching, whose primary witness was a child, whose seances drew fashionable crowds to a narrow street in Smithfield, and whose most dramatic accusation had been made against a living man who was still very much alive and present in the city. This was a ghost whose pretensions had outrun its evidence, and the nickname reflected that. It was not kind. It was also not entirely unkind. The tone of Scratching Fanny in circulation was more the mockery of an audience that feels it has been made to wait for a performance that never quite arrived than the anger of people who believe they have been deliberately deceived. That particular tone, the sardonic deflation of overstated expectations, is a characteristic London response to a sensation that has peaked and is beginning to subside, and it represents a kind of collective recalibration of the seriousness with which the case had been taken. The recalibration was not yet complete. The crowds were still coming in early 1762, and the press was still carrying accounts, and the investigation organized by Johnson's committee had not yet produced its findings. The case had not yet broken. It was at its peak of public attention, which meant that skepticism and belief were running alongside each other in the city's conversation, neither one yet dominant, the question still genuinely open in the minds of many people who had not personally attended a seance and were following the accounts in print. For those people, Scratching Fanny might have been a name they heard and half smiled at without quite committing to the dismissal it implied. The case was not yet something to be certain about. It was something to have an opinion on, which is a different condition, and one that London in 1762 seemed to find congenial. What the crowds on Cock Lane were looking for, on a purely observable level, is not entirely easy to characterize. They were looking for the sounds, obviously, the scratching in the wall, the knock for yes, the knock for no, but they were also looking for something harder to name, the particular quality of being present at something that has not yet been resolved, of standing in a room or a street where the explanation has not yet arrived, and the event is still whatever it claims to be. This is a condition that has its own quality of attention, its own kind of alertness, and it produces the particular quiet of a crowd that is listening rather than watching, waiting for a sound rather than a sight. The candles in the first-floor bedroom of the house on Cock Lane were lit. The room was full. The question was not yet answered, and in that room, in that condition, the ordinary objects of the house, the wainscoting, the floorboards, the plaster ceiling, had taken on a temporary quality of significance, the quality of things that might be about to mean something. January gave way to February, and the crowds continued. The newspaper accounts accumulated. The pamphlets multiplied. The famous visitors came and went, and wrote their letters and published their observations. Walpole in his correspondence, Johnson in his committee work, the anonymous authors of the broadsides in their workshops on Fleet Street. All of them were, in different ways and for different reasons, adding to the record of a case that had already produced more documentation than most events of this kind ever generated. The Cock Lane ghost was, among other things, a very well-documented phenomenon, which is not always the case with phenomena of this sort. The documentation is partly a product of London's particular density of print culture in the 1760s, partly a product of the case's unusual social reach across class lines, and partly a product of the fact that organized people, like Johnson, chose to treat it as something worth recording carefully. Whatever the ghost was or was not, the paper record of its existence was substantial and detailed. That record includes the failures as much as the successes, the evenings when the sounds did not come, the seances that produced nothing, the nights when the assembled company sat in the first-floor bedroom and heard only the ordinary sounds of the house settling and the distant noise of the street. Walpole's account is the most famous report of a failure, but it was not the only one. There were other evenings described in other accounts, when the scratching was absent, when the entity was quiet, when the questions went without answers. These failures were accommodated within the narrative of the case in various ways. The ghost was said to be unpredictable, or tired, or unwilling to perform before certain visitors, or delayed rather than absent. The accommodations were not always convincing, but they were available, and in the context of a public that was actively engaged with the case as an ongoing story rather than a finished one, they were sufficient to keep the question open. The question of what those failures signified would eventually become central to the case's resolution, but in early 1762, the failures were still minor notes in a larger composition, easily absorbed by the general excitement and the continuing press of public interest. The city had decided to pay attention to Cock Lane, and when a city of London's size and energy decides to pay attention to something, that attention has a momentum of its own that individual negative data points do not easily interrupt. A night when the ghost did not scratch was a night to discuss in the morning, not a reason to stop attending, and the crowds kept coming. The vendor at the edge of the crowd selling printed sheets on those January nights was doing ordinary commerce in an extraordinary setting. His customers were buying accounts of an event they were about to witness themselves, or had just witnessed, or had heard described by someone who had been there the week before. The sheets he sold would have carried the names of the living, Parsons, Kent, and the name of the dead, and the nature of the accusation the dead was said to have made against the living, and the description of the sounds in the wall that had produced this accusation. These were the facts of the case as the public knew them, or as close to the facts as the broadside press ever managed, and they were facts that many people in London had been living with for weeks, returning to in conversation and in print, turning over in the way that genuinely puzzling and unresolved cases encourage people to keep returning to them. The name Scratching Fanny fixed itself into the language of the period in a way that the original names, the case of Cock Lane, the disturbances at Parsons's house, eventually did not. A nickname of that kind is a piece of cultural compression, a way of carrying a complex event in a single phrase without having to reconstruct its full history each time the reference is made. When Horace Walpole used the name in his letters, he was using it to signal a shared understanding. His correspondent would know immediately what he meant, what tone he was taking, what his opinion of the whole affair was, without his having to state any of those things explicitly. The name had already absorbed enough of the case's history to carry meaning on its own. It was already more than a description. It was a verdict, or the beginnings of one, but the verdict was still forming in early 1762. The case had not yet broken. The crowds were still in the street, their lanterns making small moving lights in the dark of Cock Lane, their breath visible in the January cold, the house before them lit from within and full of people waiting in a first-floor bedroom for a sound in the wall. Somewhere in the city, Walpole was writing a letter about the evening he had spent in that room without hearing anything. Somewhere else, Johnson was assembling his committee of inquiry, arranging the practical details of a structured test that would allow the question to be examined under conditions that bore some relationship to careful evidence. The printers were working, the broadside sellers were working, the street was full. A ghost that communicates through knocking requires, in the first instance, a willing audience, people who have come to listen, who understand the code, who are ready to count the raps and interpret them. What the Cock Lane case had produced by its peak was an audience of that description spread across an entire city. The first-floor bedroom held 30 or 40 people on a busy night, but the city outside that room held hundreds of thousands more, many of them following the case through print, counting along with the accounts in the papers, waiting with the seance audiences for the single knock or the double knock in the wall. The house on Cock Lane was small. The audience it had acquired was not. And then there was Scratching Fanny, the name already circulating in print, already faintly mocking, already carrying its note of deflating irony against the accumulated seriousness of the preceding weeks. The name appeared in the pamphlets and the broadsides and the letters of the fashionable world, more or less simultaneously, the way such coinages do when they arrive at exactly the right moment, when the public mood has shifted just enough towards skepticism that a dismissive nickname can find purchase. It was not yet the dominant note. The dominant note was still curiosity, still the forward-leaning attention of a city that had not yet received its answer. But Scratching Fanny was there, light and dry, a little deflating, the way London always found to puncture things it had taken too seriously for too long. A city as large as London in the 1760s was always doing many things at once. On the same nights that crowds filled Cock Lane, the theaters were full, The coffee houses were full, Parliament was in session, the docks were working, and somewhere in Smithfield, the overnight drovers were moving their animals through the dark streets toward the morning market. The Cock Lane ghost was one event among many, even at the height of its celebrity. What distinguishes it, looking back at the period, is the completeness with which it seems to have crossed social boundaries, to have been, for some weeks, a genuinely shared point of reference for Londoners of very different circumstances and conditions, all of them oriented, however differently, toward the same narrow street and the same dark first-floor room. The broadside seller, working the crowd on those winter nights, was himself a piece of this picture. He was not there because he had views about the ghost, or the knocking code, or the accusation made against William Kent. He was there because a large crowd had gathered in a small street, and where a large crowd gathered, trade followed. His presence is one of the unremarkable facts that makes the event feel real in the way historical events sometimes fail to feel real. Not a performance or a set piece, but an ordinary evening in an ordinary city that had found something to pay attention to and was paying attention to it in all the ordinary ways. The narrow street absorbed all of it, the fashionable visitors and the local poor, the skeptics and the credulous, the vendors and the investigators, the reporters and the printers, Walpole with his sardonic assessment, already forming, and Johnson with his committee and his careful attention to what the evidence actually established. Cock Lane, in the winter of 1762, was a small street holding more of the city's attention than a small street ordinarily holds, and the name Scratching Fanny was its measure, the point at which the city registered that it had perhaps been holding more attention than the evidence strictly warranted, and allowed itself, not unkindly, to say so, that a city as large and quick and various as London had found something in this modest house worth gathering for, worth printing, worth visiting at night, in the cold, worth laughing about, when the moment came, is its own kind of testimony, not to the ghost, perhaps, but to the particular attention a city brings to a thing it cannot yet explain, and the particular way it releases that attention when explanation, in one form or another, finally arrives. In the house on Clerkenwell, the room was kept quiet. The investigators had made their arrangements with care, the bed positioned where they could observe it from multiple sides, the candles placed to give sufficient light without being distracting, the hour chosen so that if anything were to occur, it would occur under conditions they had designed and could attest to. Elizabeth Parsons was brought into the room and settled on the bed. Her hands were placed where they could be observed. The investigators sat with her, and they waited, and the night began to pass. Reverend Stephen Aldrich, rector of St. John Clerkenwell, had agreed to host the examination at his own residence, a deliberate choice, removing the proceedings from the Cock Lane house entirely, placing them in neutral ground where nothing in the fabric of the building could be implicated in whatever might happen. The committee had the sanction of the Lord Mayor of London. Its members were not casual visitors gathered in a darkened room out of curiosity. They were men who had come with a specific question and a method for examining it, and they sat through that night in Aldrich's house with something approaching patience, not the excited patience of the seance crowd, but the settled, professional patience of people who have decided that their presence in the room is itself the experiment. Nothing occurred. No scratching came from the walls or the floor. No knocking sounded. The room held its silence without interruption from the hour. Elizabeth Parsons arrived until the night had passed through its long middle portion, and the investigators began, quietly, to draw their conclusions. They had not received the phenomena. They had received something else, the absence of the phenomena, which was itself a form of evidence, and which they noted carefully before they left. The controlled examination at Aldrich's house in Clerkenwell was not the first attempt to test the phenomena under managed conditions, but it was the one that mattered. Previous visitors to Cock Lane had arranged themselves in the room and listened and waited, and sometimes heard things they could not account for. But the arrangement at Aldrich's house was different in a specific and significant way. It removed the one variable that had been present at every previous hearing, which was Elizabeth Parsons's freedom of movement. In her own room, on her own bed, during seances conducted in her own house, her hands had always been theoretically observable. At Aldrich's house they were actually observed, placed and held where they could not reach any hard surface, and the sounds that had been present in every other circumstance were not present here. When the small piece of wood was found, it was unremarkable in appearance, flat, and small enough to be held in a closed hand or concealed somewhere on the person of a child of 12, which was Elizabeth's age by the time the case had reached its most public phase. It had been used to produce the scratching and knocking sounds by being worked against whatever surface was available, and when it was laid on a table by the investigators, the room around it became very quiet in a particular way, not the anticipatory quiet of a seance, which was a quiet held in expectation. This was a different quality of stillness, the stillness of something having been decided, of a sequence of events that had run for several years, arriving at a specific concrete object on a table in a room in Clerkenwell. The piece of wood had a surface worn from use. It had been held many times in the dark. What the investigation had established by the time its findings were compiled and presented was not mysterious. A child had been producing sounds by concealing a small implement on her person and using it to scratch or knock against whatever surface was within reach: a board, the underside of a mattress, a wooden panel, while maintaining enough apparent stillness that observers in a darkened room had not, on most occasions, detected the source. The sounds had been real. The method had been physical and mechanical. The spirit of Fanny Lynn's had not been present at any of the evenings to which she had apparently sent her replies. The knocking had been a performance, and the performance had now been documented and ended. It is worth holding for a moment the position Elizabeth Parsons occupied in all of this. She was a child when the sounds began. She was approximately 10 or 11 years old when the first witnesses were brought into her room to listen, and she was 12 when the investigation reached its formal conclusions, and what she had been doing during the interval was producing, night after night, in front of crowds that sometimes filled the room and pressed against each other in the corridor outside it, a performance that had kept the attention of an entire city for months. The documents do not tell us what she understood of the larger scheme, or how much of what was done had been designed by her father and simply required her cooperation, or whether the cooperation had been enthusiastic or reluctant, or simply habitual. The kind of thing a child does because it has been required of her for long enough that the requiring no longer needs to be articulated. What the documents establish is that she was a child, and that the commission of the act did not rest on her alone. Richard Parsons was charged with conspiracy. The specific charge concerned the fraudulent murder accusation against William Kent, the claim transmitted through the knocking code, and interpreted by Mary Fraser for the assembled audiences over many evenings, that Kent had deliberately poisoned Fanny Lynn's with red arsenic, administered in a purgative drink. That claim had been produced by a mechanism, a small piece of wood, a child's concealed hand, a system of one knock for yes and two knocks for no, and the mechanism had been designed to name Kent as a murderer. Whether Parsons had designed it entirely himself, dubbing or in concert with others who shared the grievance against Kent, or whether the scheme had grown gradually from smaller acts of mischief into something larger and more consequential than he had originally intended. These are questions the historical record leaves partially open. The charge and the conviction concerned the conspiracy and the accusation it had produced, and the sentence was specific. Parsons stood in the pillory on 3 separate occasions at 3 different locations. One of those locations was near Cock Lane itself. The street would have been visible from where he stood. The same brick frontages, the same narrow passage running north toward Smithfield, the same modest terraced houses, whose hollow wainscoting had, a year or 2 before, given London its most talked-about address. The crowd that gathered around a man in the pillory was a different kind of crowd from the one that had filled that street in the January evenings of 1762. It had not come in a spirit of curious expectation, making its way from the West End with the sense that something worth witnessing was occurring in an ordinary house on an unremarkable street. The crowd at a pillory came for a different purpose, and what it did there was a different kind of event, and the street behind it held everything that had happened. The lodgers carried up the stairs, the loan counted out on a table, the scratching in the walls, the audiences in the darkened room, all of it finished now, and the building still standing in the winter air, exactly as it had stood before any of it began. Parsons also served a period of imprisonment. The sentence was not the harshest available for a conspiracy conviction, but historians have noted that the leniency relative to what might have been imposed reflects something of the period's ambivalence about the case, the awareness that what had been done was serious, a fraudulent murder accusation against a living man that had been sustained and amplified through public performance over many months, and at the same time, the awareness that the mechanisms of the fraud had been, when examined, remarkably simple: a small piece of wood, a child, a darkened room, a crowd that had wanted very much to hear something in the walls. William Kent, for his part, had been named publicly as a murderer by a knocking ghost for months, had sat through seances at which the entity claiming to be his dead common-law partner had repeatedly affirmed its claim against him, and had conducted himself throughout the investigation with enough consistent credibility that the committee found his account reliable. He had lent Parsons the money. He had watched Fanny Lyons die of smallpox in that first-floor room. He had then had to navigate the specific experience of being publicly identified through the medium of a child's concealed piece of wood and a binary code developed in a darkened bedroom as the man who had killed her. The historical record does not tell us where he went after the investigation concluded, or what the experience left him with, or whether the public exoneration felt sufficient against the long months of public accusation. It records his involvement, his testimony, and the finding in his favor. What happened to him after is not part of what survives. The satirical culture of Georgian London took note of the case with something approaching relish. William Hogarth, who had spent much of his working life documenting the textures and follies of the city he lived in, included the Cock Lane ghost in his final major satirical print, *Credulity, Superstition, and Fanaticism*, completed in 1762. The print is a crowded composition filled with the objects and emblems of popular irrationality, as Hogarth understood it: enthusiast preachers, thermometers measuring the temperature of religious fervor, a figure vomiting up the objects of credulity. Among these objects, the Cock Lane ghost appears. Its presence in the print is not as the main subject, but as one item among many. One example of the kind of thing a city might attend to when it had decided, for reasons it might not fully account for, that a scratching in a wall was worth traveling across the city to hear. The print sold copies. The Cock Lane ghost was fixed in the visual record of the age, not as a genuine mystery, but as an emblem of what happens when the appetite for the extraordinary outruns the patience for ordinary examination. The print carried the case into households that had not visited Cock Lane. It placed the ghost alongside the other objects of satirical attention in a way that framed it permanently. This had been a folly, a shared entertainment that had made the mistake of being taken seriously, and the consequences when it stopped being taken seriously were the appropriate consequences for a folly that had named a man as a murderer. Hogarth had seen a great deal of London, and he had drawn what he saw with a quality of attention that mixed genuine interest with genuine severity, and what he saw in the Cock Lane case was not the specific people involved, Parsons, Elizabeth Kent, Fanny Lynes, but the larger fact of what those specific people had done to a city's attention for several months, and what the city's attention said about the city. Nearly a century later, Charles Dickens opened Asterisk, A Tale of Two Cities. Asterisk, published in 1859, with a passage invoking the Cock Lane ghost as an emblem of the kind of irrational public credulity he associated with the age the novel was about to describe. The novel's famous opening describes the contradictions of the period. It was the best of times and the worst, an age of wisdom and an age of foolishness, and nestled within that catalogue of contradictions is the Cock Lane ghost, offered as evidence that a century earlier the public had been inclined to receive communications from departed spirits through a scratching in a wall, and had accepted those communications with a seriousness that the later century found, if not simply incomprehensible, at least worth noting as a symptom of something that could happen when a period's habits of belief met a particular and well-managed situation. Dickens was not being straightforwardly contemptuous. His tone in that opening passage holds both the mockery and something warmer, the recognition that credulity of this kind is not a sign of stupidity, but of the human tendency to find significant what feels significant, and to hold on to that feeling past the point where the evidence supports it. That the case survived into Dickens's imagination, that it was available to him in 1859 as an immediately recognizable cultural shorthand, is itself a fact about how fully the Cock Lane ghost had been absorbed into the cultural memory of London and of England. By 1859, it had been almost exactly 100 years since the scratching was first reported in the first-floor bedroom of Richard Parsons's house in Smithfield. It had been 100 years since the crowds had gathered in the narrow street on winter evenings, since Samuel Johnson had stood in the room with his committee, since the small piece of wood had been found and the knocking had stopped, and yet the case was still legible, still available as a reference that a novelist could drop into a paragraph and expect his readers to follow without gloss. The Cock Lane ghost had a long afterlife for something that had lasted, in its active phase, only a few months. Samuel Johnson's involvement deserves a particular note in any account of how the case was finally settled, because his position throughout was one of genuine complexity. Johnson was a deeply religious man who believed in the possibility of spiritual phenomena. He had written about the subject, and his belief was not casual or unreflective. He was also a rigorous empiricist who believed that evidence of spiritual phenomena needed to meet the same standards of honest examination that any other evidence met, and that the willingness to believe was not itself evidence that something worth believing was present. He had gone to Cock Lane personally. He had sat in the room. He had heard what others heard, or had been present on evenings when what others reported was either absent or insufficient, and he had taken part in the formal investigation, helped organize it, been involved in framing its findings with the same quality of attention he brought to everything else, which was the attention of a man who thought seriously about what was in front of him and said what he found rather than what the moment seemed to want him to say. The investigation's findings were published. They stated, clearly and without ambiguity, that the phenomena had not been produced by any supernatural agency, that they had been produced by the child, and that the accusation against William Kent was without foundation in fact. Johnson put his name to those findings. That a man of his particular religious convictions was willing to put his name to findings of that kind, that he had gone to the site, examined the evidence, and returned with a conclusion that cut against the direction his beliefs might have taken him, is one of the things that made the case's resolution as definitive as it was. When Samuel Johnson said there was nothing in the walls, the people who had been inclined to believe there was something there had to weigh that against a significant authority. The house itself, the specific building on Cock Lane where the events occurred, did not survive into the present. The street did. Cock Lane runs today along its original course, north from Newgate Street toward West Smithfield, the route that a walker in 1762 would have taken, the same narrow passage that the crowds had filled on those winter evenings when the whole of London seemed to want to be in it at once. The buildings along it are not the buildings that stood then. The city of London was rebuilt many times across the centuries, and the specific brick fronts of the Georgian terraces that the witnesses and visitors and investigators entered and exited are gone, but the street is still there. The geography persists. The course of it, the relative narrowness, the way it connects Newgate Street to the wider space of Smithfield to the north, these things are unchanged, and a person walking it today walks something that exists in the same relation to the city as the thing the crowds walked in 1762. At the junction of Cock Lane and Giltspur Street, mounted on the corner of a building, there is a small carved wooden figure. It is known as the Golden Boy of Pye Corner, or sometimes simply the Fat Boy, and it marks the place where the Great Fire of London stopped in 1666, just having spread east and north across the city, from its origin point near Pudding Lane until it reached this particular corner and went no further. The figure is small and gilded, a rounded cherubic shape mounted on a bracket above the street level, and it has been there in various forms since at least the early 18th century, which means it was already mounted at that corner, looking down at the street during all the years of the Cock Lane affair, and was still mounted there when the investigation concluded, and when Parsons stood in the pillory, and when the broadside printers moved on to the next story, and when the crowd that had gathered on winter evenings dispersed back into the ordinary life of the city and stopped gathering. The Great Fire's boundary is not something immediately visible in the modern street. The city rebuilt over the burn line, and the buildings that stand at Pye Corner now bear no obvious trace of the fire in their fabric. The Golden Boy is the marker, the carved wooden record that here the fire stopped, that somewhere in the structure of this corner something held against the spread, and that the city decided it was worth commemorating that fact with a small gilded, enduring object mounted where people passing below it could see it if they looked up. It was put there as a record. It remains there as a record. The record it keeps is not primarily about the Cock Lane ghost. The ghost arrived nearly 70 years after the fire, and the figure was already there, marking the older event when the scratching in the walls began. But it is at the top of Cock Lane. It is the figure that persists at the entrance to the street where the scratching was heard. The persistence of the Golden Boy is a physical fact about the city, one of thousands of such facts, markers and monuments and older structures folded into the surface of an urban space that has been continuously inhabited and continuously rebuilt over centuries. What makes it notable in relation to the Cock Lane case is not any direct connection between the fire and the fraud. It is simply the fact of duration. The Golden Boy was at that corner before the Cock Lane ghost was heard. It was there during the years the ghost was heard. It was there when the investigation concluded and the knocking stopped and the crowds dispersed. It is still there. The cars pass below it on a present-day afternoon with the same indifference that the drovers and tradespeople of Smithfield passed below it in the 18th century, and the figure on its bracket continues to mark the old boundary of the old fire, looking down at the junction of Cock Lane and Giltspur Street with the same expression it has always had, which is the expression of a carved wooden object that does not require anything from the people who pass beneath it. What the Cock Lane case left behind, after the pillory and the imprisonment and the published findings and the satirical prints and the century of references in novels and pamphlets, is not primarily a mystery. The mystery was solved, the mechanism was found, the person operating the mechanism was identified, and the person who had designed and directed the operation was tried and sentenced. The question of whether Fanny Lyons had been poisoned by William Kent was settled by the finding that the claim had been manufactured, that the death from smallpox was the documented record, and that the arsenic accusation had been produced by a binary code administered through a concealed piece of wood in a child's hand. None of the open questions the case presents are questions about what happened in the walls. Those questions were answered. The open questions are of a different kind. They are questions about how a city of that size and sophistication came to fill a narrow street on winter evenings to listen for scratching in the walls of a rented house in Smithfield. They are questions about what the appetite for phenomena of this kind says about the people who shared it, not as a criticism of those people who were as thoughtful and practical in most of the areas of their lives as people tend to be, but as a genuine inquiry into what it is that makes a particular kind of unverified report so persuasive that it requires a formal committee with the sanction of the Lord Mayor to examine it. Samuel Johnson went personally. Horace Walpole went personally. The broadside printers sent their accounts out into the city week after week because the city was buying them. These were not naive people attending naively to a naive story. They were people for whom the Cock Lane ghost was, for a period, genuinely worth their attention. The case endured in cultural memory because it was a clean example, a case in which the mechanism was found, the fraud was documented, the sentence was carried out, and the satirical response was sharp enough to crystallize the lesson clearly. It became useful as a reference precisely because it was so completely explained, so fully resolved at the level of what had actually happened. The Cock Lane ghost, as an emblem in later writing, is always the ghost that was not there. The knocking that came from a child's hand, the accusation that was manufactured, the crowd that gathered in good faith to receive something that was not being offered in good faith. It stands in for a particular kind of error, which is the error of finding significance in something that has been arranged to feel significant, of attending to an effect without examining its cause. And yet the street persists. The course of it persists. The short passage running from Newgate Street up toward Smithfield, the buildings along it, changed and changed again across the centuries, but the space between them continuous, the geography of it holding what it has always held, which is simply a particular relationship between one part of the city and another, People walk it now on their way between one place and another, as people walked it in 1762 on their way to and from the livestock market, and the fact that one winter several thousand of them walked it specifically to stand outside a brick house and wait for a scratching in the walls is not written anywhere visible in the fabric of the street. It is a fact that belongs to the record, to the published findings, the broadside accounts, the private letters of men like Walpole, the satirical prints, the occasional footnotes in novels, the archives, and the street itself holds none of it explicitly. What is explicit is the Golden Boy. At the junction of Cock Lane and Giltspur Street, the small carved figure remains on its bracket at the corner of the building, above the level where most people's eyes naturally fall when they are walking and thinking about where they are going, rather than what is mounted on the walls above them. It has been there through everything the immediate area has experienced: the Cock Lane ghost, the rebuilding, the changes to the street's purpose and traffic, the shift from livestock market to modern city district, the cars replacing the drovers, the glass and steel of the financial district rising behind the older stone buildings that survived long enough to become protected rather than replaced. Through all of that, the Golden Boy has simply persisted on its bracket at the top of the street, marking the boundary where the fire stopped, doing what it was placed there to do, which is to be a record. On a present-day afternoon, the junction is ordinary. The traffic moves through it on its way between the Barbican and Farringdon and the Old Bailey and the city. People cross at the lights. Someone stops at the corner and looks at a map on a phone. The winter light, if it is winter, falls on the brick and concrete and glass of the buildings with the flat, sourceless quality that winter light in a north-facing city has. Not dramatic, not beautiful in any insistent way, just the ordinary light of a cold afternoon in a dense urban space. And the Golden Boy is there on its bracket, the gilded wooden figure, a little above the ordinary level of vision, the great fire's boundary marked at the top of the lane where the scratching in the walls was heard, and then explained, and then absorbed into the long record of things that happened in this city and are still, in the quietest way, present